Morning, everyone. Can you hear me? This talk began as research for our servants' quarters at Newbridge House and Farm, which you all have to come and see, plug. And really, it's about piecing together all the piecemeal references to servants that appear to anybody who's researching not even just the Irish country house, but history, because they appear everywhere. And the historical narrative around the Irish country house has long recognised its place at the epicentre of the community, economically, socially, culturally, and particularly because in Ireland, where industry was very underdeveloped and less frequent, it often was the Irish country house that was the largest employer and engaged the local workforce in a symbiotic relationship that was about, progressing the estate, achieving targets, turning the cogs. And it also had the effect of sustaining many crafts, trades, labours, and traditions. And despite this role of servants at a sort of economic centre ground, most of what has been written about the country house is mostly focused on the inhabitants and their lives, and the interiors. Very little has been written about the multitude of staff and workers who have operated this economic machine. And further research on the area of servant life and their accommodation is required to develop our understanding of their contribution to the Irish country house. And more than just the economic relationship of, these people earning a wage out of the economic benefit of having country houses and people living. There was also this weird phenomenon that they were actually living in your house with you, that you were paying them, they were doing you a job, they had a task to do, they had key objectives, what we'd call today KPIs, key performance indicators. They had to do this job, but you also lived very cheek by jowl with them. And the opening talk, I've obviously moved on. Dismissed to the general joy of the family is a quote that'll come up later on. But the reference to the family is the entire household, because in the 18th century, your family was everybody who lived in the house, not necessarily just the relations, but the family included the workers and the people who lived under the one roof. So it's an interesting sort of term that's become unfamiliar. And as time has gone on, the level of decrepitude in the spaces of the servants' quarters often derives from the absence of the Irish country house that has really come about since the 1920s. And as staff numbers dwindled and, these servants' quarters declined and they became places to abandon furniture, the more recent times, these servants' quarters have been requisitioned as cafes, as gift shops, and in even some country houses as distilleries. But Rosina Harrison, who's written a lot about servants, accredits upstairs, downstairs, has given my life's work a dignity and purpose that was not recognised before and has shown myself and my friends and colleagues as human, real and useful members of society. But really it was that process of relegating servants then becoming more and more rare to almost becoming unfamiliar and uncommon to people remembering that Lord Milo Talbot de Malahide, who lived in Malahide Castle up until 1973, he was one of the few people in this area who actually had a butler, that it started to become a bit phenomenal, that that they started making shows like Upstairs, Downstairs and more latterly Downton Abbey because servants and having servants became a bit of a phenomenon. But really to many people in Fingal in particular, their ancestors earned a huge amount of money as servants and sort of earned their craft and their skill. And there's a lot of people when they come to visit these country houses after seeing the drawing room, they come down the stairs and they go, this is where we'd be, because people sort of relate to the kind of work that went on in the country house much more so than the piano playing and the listening to music and admiring art upstairs. But they're very important variety of lived experiences in these country houses and across the island of Ireland, and they had a varying different economic and social group servants as a class. And so one of the things I'm going to try to do today is skim through the different kind of jobs that you could find yourself doing in the country house, and kind of as you compare them amongst the country houses of Fingal, you can see the comparisons and the variety that kind of sprang up. And it's not this kind of very one way, very ordered, very systematic kind of approach that we might think of, that, Downton Abbey is actually only one house in one area of England, and it's a very tightened kind of view of what service was actually like. But also servants weren't the preserve of the extreme wealthy. In 1835, as many as 5 farmers in the South Dublin Valley of Glenismole had servants. One farmer, Andrew Doyle, had 2 servant boys and 1 servant girl, and he was only renting 19 acres of farmland. and he had 3 staff to help him around running the farm and the house. And that kind of goes to show you the cheap cost of labour in Ireland at the time. Now, records, when you're trying to piece together servant life, is very interesting. For example, the Knockdrin wage book of 1848 to 55 only records the salaries of the male staff, that the female staff were just sort of disregarded, and they were kept somewhere else, or their wages were recorded by another senior male staff. That Sir Richard Leving, the man of the house, thought it beneath his notice to record the female wages and their names. Similarly, the 1857 to 83 Malahide Castle Servants' Wage Book only records male staff. And often, many household records, you only get a glimpse of the servants' time in the big house from a brief or throwaway mention. A reference detailing their arrival may be elusive. A brief payment of wages may be their first record, and their departure is only notable by their replacement arriving. Because time might have been very short spent in these houses. But many more workers exist, their whole life can be recorded in these account books. And there are expenses for the train fare on their arrival. A bill for their coffin might be the final mention in the house because they've spent their whole life there. And these people appear again and again in the records, often not just as workers, but as close allies, companions, and often even friends. But there's a very interesting 18th century guide that was written for young girls of the aristocracy. And the writer positions it, she says, "I wish to know," writes the author, how you would have us behave to our servants. And the reply comes, and I quote, "With humanity and condescension, you should always remember, notwithstanding they are your inferiors, they are also your fellow creatures, and in your conduct towards them equally avoid haughtiness and familiarity. Maintain your own dignity, nor never lose it. By permitting a servant to joke with you or partake of your recreations, such proceedings are not the effect of humility, but of deprived taste and a meanness of spirit. There are some persons so fond of superiority, they choose to associate with those who are beneath them and dependent upon them, for no other reason than the opportunity it affords them of gratifying their inclinations without control or reproach." So it's this sort of careful balancing act. Don't become too friendly, you're their superior, but also you have to be sort of kind to these people because you want them to do quite difficult tasks for you. The 18th century experiences of country houses are the most fun because the 18th century experience of service was very different from what we might think of, which is a very Edwardian view. Samuel Madden talks in 1738, and he says, and I quote, "We keep many of them in our houses as we do plate on our sideboards, more for the show than for use, and rather to let people see that we have them than we have any occasion for them." Irish country houses were, and I quote, "remarkable for the number of servants and various hangers-oners, some of whom are given odd jobs for payment in kind." This was one of the noteworthy factors of the Irish country house in comparison to the English counterparts. And when William Thackeray came to Ireland in 1842, he wrote, and I quote, "numerous people loitering about the stables and outhouses." And he says, in comparison with England, I quote, "the immense following of the Irish country house was such as it would make an English housekeeper crazy." So basically, this is this economic role of the Irish country house, that all these people were loitering about trying to get employment, and it was through who you knew that you'd get a good job. But also there was a sort of dependency going on, and the Countess of Moira, Elizabeth, writes to her daughter after the death of a long-time servant called Lowry. She writes, and I quote, "Poor Lowry has left me his wife as a legacy, affirming in his last minutes that I could never let her want. I do not know what to do with her. I have no want of this servant, nor could I put her in that station," underlined. "I have wrote to her brother, who is in affluent circumstances, to try if he would not put her in some way of business. In that case, I could continue to assist her. You will be certain I shall not contradict the wishes nor disappoint the confidence poor Lowry has placed in me." It's a rather difficult situation. Some Irish gentry, on their arrival into Ireland, decried the poor quality of the Irish servants they found working in their houses. Lady Portarlington from Emo wrote to her sister in 1781, and I quote, "I am all out of patience with the slovenliness and the dirt of the people of Ireland. I have just been hiring a housemaid who is an Englishwoman in the hopes of getting my house clean." Like many others, the Cobbs of Newbridge House had a paternalistic approach to keeping servants. Lady Dorothea Cobb would take servants into her employment almost as charity. such as in 1792 when she wrote, "We hired Pat the Postilion." Sounds like a Thomas the Tank Engine character. Pat the Postilion was given, by my orders, 1 year wages, which was £4 12 shillings, and an order to wash himself. For the less well-off, and particularly in the household of an archbishop, they were providing a decent place to live and a standard of living and a standard of work, clothing, food, shelter, which was quite an important service. So this is the sort of combination of records that you would try to use to put back together the life of the servants. And if you were here before listening to Declan's talk, it's rather interesting. He was talking about service. He was talking about the Poor Law Union, and that's rather important because the servants are effectively the poor people, and there's a hierarchical dynamic going on here in the house. And for ordinary working people to get a job in a country house was rather very important. With the land tenure system and prevalent rack renting going on in Ireland, if you came from a house that wasn't necessarily tied to the land, if you were a labouring cottier class family and you were one of the younger children, and as the 1750s moved on in Ireland, there was an appetite for larger scale farming, more intensive farming, and the sort of agricultural revolution was going on, and as it was going on, it was marginalising a class of people, which was often the younger inhabitants of the cottier class, the younger members of the family. And it was creating a section of society that required employment outside of the family farm. And often it was the country house that was a way of letting these people move away from subsistence living. And it's a sort of important kind of way, the country house employment and what Thackeray is talking about, these masses amount of people hanging around, it's their way of trying to stay away from the poverty trap. And it's a good way to improve your standard. Certainly a way to keep children out of the workhouse or destitution was to get them a job of some scale in an Irish country house. And, it was okay to leave school up to the age of 14 as late as 1972. So you've got sort of 300 years of history of people trying to find work as a maid or as a work boy in service, basically. And also, coming from poverty, if you got a job in an Irish country house, it was the livery and the uniform that was provided for you by your employer that was often seen as a way of sort of shirking your poverty, because you became a stanchion of the family, and you started to reflect the family's wealth that you worked for. So it wasn't this kind of like torturous thing that people had to do. They had to go into a workhouse. Sometimes people were very drawn into this kind of profession. Frances Power Cobb, the daughter of Newbridge, remembered fondly from her childhood in the 1820s the presence of an old servant called Ali, who must have been a great age, for she had been this is a quote, "She had been under dairymaid to my great-great-grandfather, the Archbishop, and used to tell us stories of the old times." So imagine growing up in 1820 and you had somebody there who had started work in the 1740s and was telling you what it was like in your great-great-grandfather's time. Frances recalls her distinctive appearance as the old maid around the estate. She was, and I quote, "the last wearer of the real old Irish scarlet cloak in our part of the country." And she says, "And I can remember admiring it greatly when I used to run by her side and help her to carry her bundle of sticks." And Ali appears quite frequently in the account books, and she's given these kind of jobs for payment in kind to kind of keep her involved in the house. And you'll see there, Frances Power Cobb also writes, "The poor people were welcome to come eat and drink at the great house on every excuse or without any excuse at all." This state of things was almost so perfectly in harmony with the Celtic idea. By that she means the idea of bountiful hospitality. And the days when it prevailed are still sighed after as the good old times, i.e. when people could just wander into the Irish country house. And Frances Power Cobb remembers them being fed with jugfuls of beer and platefuls of meat. So there was a lot there. Before 1838, Ireland was perceived to be too poor for poor relief. And indeed, the poor relief system didn't need to exist in some communities where the Irish poverty class were being supported by jobs in the Irish country house. But there was a difference between the Irish poor and the English working classes. To the British, Irish poverty was the root of the backwardness of the nation. The poor in Ireland were being separated in society linguistically, culturally, and obviously through their religion. And the 19th century charity for poor in Ireland depended very much on displaying the ability and the want to work. And there's very clear and different definitions of charity from what we understand it today. The physical ability to work, but also the desire and the spirit towards work, it helped you to avoid the image of relying on the workhouse. And it was those who were unable to work due to momentary sickness or age-related frailty who were deserving charity and could be given pensions and annuities and gratuities. But as long as you were fit for work, there was always a job for you in an Irish country house. And this was different, that you had the virtuous poor and the slovenly poor who were perceived as being too lazy, and the place for them was the workhouse. Whereas the virtuous poor of sort of Catholic imagery were the people who were able to work but just couldn't necessarily find that work at that time. In 1899 in Newbridge, we have a letter from the steward, Mr. Hill, writing to Mrs. Cobb, and he says, and I quote, "I told old Phoenix the week before last he might not come any longer, as he was here only 2 or 3 days since you left, and that you had ordered half wages to be sent to him, the same as to Pat Murphy and other men. He was quite satisfied, as the man could hardly walk, having some sores on his feet, in addition to his enfeebled state of extreme old age, some 82 or 83 years. So here's a man who had started work in the 1820s and was still there in 1899, doing odd jobs around the estate, because there was no need for him to go home. There's no idea that at 65 you would be given a pension and just sit at home and do whatever you wanted. As long as you were fit to work, there was a job for you. Also, there is the age-old battle in the 18th century against drunkenness in the Irish house, which comes up again and again. And drunkenness is seen as a catch-all term about distrust of a servant. And also, drunkenness was a chief characteristic of the ignoble poor. It's very different from having an illness or possessing a lack of ability to want to work. And the Irish poor could be described as, and I quote, totally unacquainted with the ordinary conveniences of civilized life by some. And a good way of avoiding the workhouse was often, service in the Irish country house. The shelter and the accommodation provided by the Irish country house was also very important. It wasn't really until the 1893 Local Government Act that labourers' cottages were being built by compensation. And up until that point, the Irish economy was dependent on the landlords to provide housing for these people that were working for them, either on their estate or around the area. So there's a huge amount of economy going into this. Lady Louisa Connolly of Castletown was a very thorough bookkeeper, and we know she kept a close eye on her accounts, but yet she had 46 servants at Castletown for her husband, and all their guests. In 1787, Connolly spent £656 just on servants' wages, and she spent a further £254 on their clothes. So keeping servants was a huge job, and it was this economic benefit that you were providing was important. But when you read through these wage books, it's kind of gas. The things they employed people to do, all manner of aspects of running around a large country house. In 1782, Robert Dillon, Lord Clonbrok, hired Patrick Nicholson as a dog boy for £3 a year, whatever that involves. In 1826, Lord Bective of Headford employed a rat killer called Pat Lavery for the yearly sum of £5. At Knockdrin, the Levin family also included the cost of the local schoolmaster's wages in their servants' books. At Headford House, technically, you could argue in Fingal, between the 10th and 14th of February 1829, there were 20 members of staff. There were 20 members of the family, necessitating 48 servants. So that's a pretty good ratio for whatever you need. On the 4th of January in 1888, they had a whole host of guests, including some people from Scotland and England, totaling 50 dinner guests. And with the servants and the family, that accounts to 117 persons being fed in the house. And we know this because in Headford, the Marquess of Hertford had these amazing records. They're sort of like kept by the housekeeper, and she records how many people sat to dinner every night in every room of the house. So you know who's eating in the parlour, who's eating in the dining room, who's eating in the servants' hall, all the meals of the day. So you can accumulate them all. The biggest ever was the 3rd of May, 1892, when there were 200 guests to dinner. And when you account for the 29 servants on top of the 8 family, that led to the cook producing 237 meals in one night. But of course that didn't last, and by the 20th century many great houses in Fingal were feeling the pinch. In 1914 at Newbridge, owing to the cost of everything, the Great War, etc., rising cost of insurance, the laundry maid was let go, and the washing was thenceforth set into the Dublin Metropolitan Laundry in the city, which gave them the great affordability of hiring a kitchen maid to help out the cook. By 1916, Newbridge House, money had gotten so tight that they were only able to keep on their payroll the cook, the housemaid, a footman, and a chauffeur. That's a very sympathetic aha. Trust was very important amongst the hierarchy of staff. In 1741, Simon Brown was dismissed by the Archbishop of Dublin on the grounds that he was, and I quote, "he was sober, but I fear not very honest." There's also the story of Sir John O'Neill Lentane, who lived in Merrion Square, and he had taken in a maid on a second chance. She had been caught stealing, and he gave her a second chance and brought her back into the family. She served faithfully for 40 years, and then she was retiring and going back to her native Kerry. She died on the train, and her suitcases were found full of the family silver. So the distrust loomed large in hiring these people to come live in your house. But the perks of working on an Irish country house were great. In the 20th century, the staff living on the domain in Malahide Castle got free milk from the castle, which was from the Jersey herd cow, which was being fed to HB Ice Cream and Bewley's. And when I asked one of the former occupants of the estate, whose father worked on the estate, I said, "Well, what was it like? It must have been the most amazing milk." It was just milk, because they didn't know any better. It came from a can from the yard, and the families also had never want of firewood. And one Christmas, they remember being gifted a photograph of Lord Milo for their table. Now, butlers. We better pick up pace. Lachlan McGrath, or Lynn McGrath, as he was called, was hired by the Archbishop Cobb of Newbridge House in 1729 as a coachman, and he was paid £4. With the added note, hired Lynn McGrath and to wash himself. And he had, by my orders, 3/4 wages. So these people were paid to go off, wash themselves, and then start work. His wages then, 6 years later, were increased to £8. So he'd started as coachman, £8, and then he's clearly doing very well. The censor promotion, and then he remains as coachman until 1743, when the Archbishop records a payment to Lynn to serve as butler. So he gets promoted to butler, and he stays on this £8. And then the Archbishop is then hiring 2 butlers, there's Ed Hearn and Lynn McGrath, and they're both serving. And this is curious because he's either having a country butler and a city butler, or it's because he's moving back and forth to England. He's leaving one behind and bringing one with him. Because Lynn was also married, because we know when Lynn goes to Winchester with the Archbishop, his wife is paid to sort of compensate for the loss of her husband, because he's going away to Winchester with his wages and God knows what he's doing. So the wife is being given a wage to stay at home. Lynn's brother, Peter McGrath, is then given a job as a footman. So a bit of nepotism going on here. But then a year later, he was given his wages and discharged. And the Archbishop quote, "He was honest, but I fear a sot." So productivity, hard work, and honesty were key values, particularly to work in an archiepiscopal household. There was an elder butler, James Billingsley, hired in 1733, and the Archbishop comments on him, and I quote, "He was a very honest, sober servant, and was discharged because I had no further occasion for him." There's absolutely nothing Christian about giving somebody a job and having no work for them to do, so they're just as easily dismissed. But what's interesting is that Billingsley is given £10, whereas Lynn McGrath is only on £8 as butler. So if you're hiring in somebody who's already working as a butler, you're sort of hiring in them qualified, whereas training somebody up in Ireland through the ranks, starting as coachman or footman and then becoming butler, is cheaper because you don't have to pay them as much, because otherwise they come in. But by 1781, Domville in Santry Court hires William Gould for 14 guineas per annum as his butler. By 1790, Lord Clonbrock in Galway is hiring Des Glynn as his valet and my own man and butler at 16 guineas. And he was illiterate, but also married. Because, of course, there's no better way to guarantee trustworthiness in a man than if he's married and has a family that depend on him for a salary. By 1820, the butler in Clonbrock was earning £45 a year, which is a pretty good salary. This is a graph that I put together that shows the turnover of butlers at Malahide Castle in the 1850 period. Now, William Morehouse was a butler listed there, and he's earning £50 a year for the 4th Baron Talbot de Malahide. But he has 6 children, and he's a very ill wife, so he's frequently going away to Belgium, to the spa towns, and to England, to places like Malvern. And this haphazard occupancy of Malahide Castle, coming and going on holidays, educating his children in England, means that the butlers are hired and fired as the family come and go, which leads to a much higher turnover of the butlers, considering that at the same period in Newbridge there was 2. So each colour alludes to a different butler, and the time frame you'll see is only about a 12-month sort of period. Whereas the average stay for a butler in this period is only 18 months. There's a guy there, you'll see the pink is John Doyle, and he's their butler in the 1860s. He's taken a 2-year stint, and then he's dismissed in the winter, and then hired again the summer following 2 years. So this is if you're thinking about John Doyle's life, as Talbot comes and goes, he's let go and hired again. But the fact that 2 years later he's able to be hired again by Talbot either means that Talbot's a very worthy employer, that you'd rather go work for the big lord in Fingal, because if you think about the amount of aristocrats in Fingal, there's not that many titled men. So there's an attraction of going to work for Lord Talbot de Malahide, or that there's just such insecure employment in the mid-19th century for very qualified staff because of the high rate of absenteeism and families going back and forth for Parliament to England and to sit in their English seats and going on holidays. And the Talbot family in this period were frequently enjoying trips to Italy, Switzerland, France, Spain and Belgium, and unfortunately very few staff were kept on their books when they were leaving, and they would leave the house almost vacant. But they were paying anywhere between £40 to £50 for their butlers, whereas the highest butler at Newbridge was only paid £42, but he was the highest member of indoor staff, highest paid member of indoor staff. But the Cobbs at Newbridge never go anywhere for very long periods. They're a full-time resident landlord, and that kind of has its own perk, which doesn't have to be remunerated. But at Headford, the butler was earning £84 per annum, which is a huge job. And again, you're working for a marquess as opposed to a baron, so they must have some commensurate pay scale there for the aristocracy. There's a very practical guide that has been given to us by Edward Nugent, who was the penultimate butler at Malahide, serving for 39 years up until 1973. And the guide is absolutely fantastic. It covers a wealth of knowledge, sort of how Lord Talbot likes the table laid, caring and for the furniture, decanting wine, how you announce guests, which was awfully difficult, and the ambassador and how you have to announce him. And there's a lot more site-specific stuff, like where to buy the replacement coffee filters and which carpets are prone to moth infestations. And he also gives the sage advice of the discretion of every butler, advising on the old adage, hear no evil, see no evil, and speak no evil. There's Edward Nugent at the front of the castle at the time of his retirement, and I'm very grateful to the Nugent family for these photographs. And here he is at Dunboyne Castle, where he started as a footman and then later came to Malahide as their butler in 1939. He'd grown up on the Wexford-Carlow border. I think often we think that these people are all from down the lane and are hired to come up and work, but actually a lot of servants you'll find travel very far to get a good job, particularly when they're highly qualified. His wife was from the west of Ireland, but they had met in Enniscorthy and then moved to Malahide. They were given a house by Lord Talbot, which we fondly called the Peter Pan Cottage, and then he subsequently, when their family got too big, built them an even bigger house on the edge of the estate. To the family, Edward Nugent's children, it was just a job, really, butling, even though it was quite unusual. They were given a television by Lord Milo. There were very few employers in the 1960s giving their staff televisions. He also replaced his bike with a car. Edward Nugent's bike was replaced with a car. And when he got skin cancer, Lord Milo paid for him to go to a medical specialist in Harley Street, and he paid the full expense of his trip there and back. So clearly, a very good butler in 20th century Ireland is well worth keeping. And what my favourite story is that in the local area, they were known as the Castle Nugents, as opposed to the Butcher Nugents. Footmen were harder to keep. No doubt, as young men were prone to wander and seek greater venture, and further afield, unlike their female counterparts. They were also very troublesome in the household and could cause a lot of feathers to be upset. In the 18th century, the footmen were hired, particularly more in rural locations, often had no previous experience of the job and had to be kitted out from head to toe. Lord Clonbrock hired Michael Cusack as a footman, having fired the previous incumbent for drunkenness. He was given £9 a year, and was paid for the second year an additional £10 to find himself in boots and breeches. His replacement, after only 2 years, Pat Houlihan, was hired at 8 guineas, with the proviso, if he lives with me 2 years, to have 9 guineas the second year, and so on. So they had to come up with this incentivization scheme to keep the footman from wandering off. And unfortunately, Pat was not the solution, because he was immediately discharged, giving him 1 shilling for the 2 nights he was here, having been found drunk. Because clearly, if you were fond of the drink, a cellar in a big Irish country house was the place to be. The Duke of Leinster at Carton paid £4 per annum to a footman. He paid an additional £4 per annum to the footman if he stayed up to 5 years. This is like getting a sort of bonus, all the big companies give you today. Unmarried footmen at Carton were required because of the pace of hectic life travelling between Carton and Leinster House. Some footmen were very multifaceted, such as James Long, who was hired as and I quote, as footman and to fowl in the country, giving him £10 a year. So he was clearly very qualified at going out and doing a lot of shooting. Domville at Santry Court gave comparable wages to his footman, and he would also give the same wages to a porter, which is presumably just a footman who's just standing around opening doors. But it was a fairly standard practice that if a footman did very well, he could go on and become a coachman or a groom, which was a lot more experience. And because you had to work with horses, which were very expensive, you had to be able to work with leather goods, and being elevated to the stables usually came with greater remuneration, and it was seen as a senior role because of all the expenses families were paying on their carriages and their stabling. There was also a very high level of detail some families took. The Talbots of Malahide Castle had their coachmen's liveries specially designed by George MacDonald of 32 Molesworth Street, and they have the books of all the liveries being made for each servant. They wore a frock coat with leggings, a yellow vest, claret pluck breeches, and a tweed suit, a Devon overcoat, and crested buttons, spending as much as £32 a year just on liveries for their footmen and coachmen. And this is because when you're processing through the streets, you can immediately recognise those handsome, well-dressed men on the back of the carriage. Oh, they're Lord Talbot's very well-kitted-out men. But there are also many, many stories. At Newbridge, I remember my excitement finding in the archive a little bundle of papers in an envelope that was called Harry Clarke's References. And some of you may know there's a Harry Clarke reference. There's a Harry Clarke window in Donabate, and I thought, gold mine, art historical gold mine. And after finding Harry Clarke's references, it was the footman, even more interesting. And it's his little bundle of references, and it tells you all his different houses he's worked in, because as you leave every house, you get a reference from the steward or the butler or somebody, and you arrive to your next house, and you hand in all your references, so it gives you sort of history, your working history. And he had to sign on. They had these almost like dole offices for unemployed staff. And the most common problem is that people in Northern Ireland are going back to the UK and leaving their footmen behind, and he can't get regular employment. So obviously he comes to Newbridge and stays there very, very long. So it gives you a kind of, he has to answer all these questions. Have you gone out with carriage? Have you ever helped carve? Do you wish to go under a butler? Would you go single-handed into a family? Or there's the very unfortunate, if you were a footman working in Fingal, you could have had the troubled experience of living through the 1920s in Ireland, such as Frank Higgins, who was the footman at Newbridge. And Mrs. Cobb recorded in her diary on the 15th of October 1924, and I quote, at about 9:15, Higgins came in and going up to Cyril's chair said, I beg your pardon, sir, but there are 2 armed men masked at the front door who wish to see you. And they say that Mr. Corbally is to come out at once. He spoke in such a cool and ordinary tone of will that we had to make him repeat the words twice before we took them in. And they were very frightened. And it's a very funny story, but the 2 burglars actually wait at the front door for Mr. Corbally to come. So obviously the footman goes to ring the civic guard, and then Cyril comes out, he gets his gun, and they run down the driveway. And they're eventually arrested and sent to prison. Brave footmen to poor maids. Often maids aren't really even fully named in the accounts, and their records are very scant. Charles Cobb often records the laundry maid, Marianne, and that's all he gives, or simply paid the wages to the kitchen maid, he doesn't include what her name is, or to Jane, the housemaid, whereas all the other male staff, their full name is given, William Smith, the butler. And the Headford wage book in 1827, 3 girls in the garden are paid 2 pence a day for their work in the garden. A housemaid in 1826 on board wages at Headford was only earning 7 shillings a week, whereas a lady's maid, which is the top pecking order of maids, is paid £20 a week, which is as much as the head laundry maid or the town housemaid. The poorest paid staff were the scullery maids or the still room maids, who were only given a paltry £8 per annum. A new scullery maid in 1866 was paid £12 per annum, which is a huge increase on her predecessor. And Bridget Connell was elevated to the schoolroom maid with a £2 wage increase, because you're dealing with his lordship's children. A lady's maid was quite separate from the rest of the body of the staff, because she reported directly to the lady of the house, which gave her hierarchy over everybody else, of course. And their daily conduct with the lady of the house added to their distinction and status. But throughout Newbridge, much of the history, their ladies' maids sort of come and go, and they have varying sort of quasi-housekeeping roles. Lady Betty Cobb in the 18th century was the first chatelaine of Newbridge, and she kept her own lady's maid and was given £4 for 8 months' work. And she records, "My maid, Mary Johnson." And then Thomas Cobb is also sort of paying them, which indicates that they were doing a lot of work as housekeeper, but it seems that this maid had come with Lady Betty when she got married, so you could also often bring your maid to your new married home, which would obviously ruffle a lot of feathers. But ladies' maids were very important in the 18th century for the back and forth to England, because they would handle all the dirty things like the money on the boats and down the dockyards and make sure all the luggage was being transported. Lady Astor used to travel with 99 cases. And her lady's maid and the footman would have to accommodate 99 cases with lists and make sure they all made it back between New York and London. And there's a great payment by Lady Betty for Mrs. Molyneux, and Mrs. Molyneux shows up for a long time, and she's replaced by Mrs. Anne, and Mrs. Anne is being paid to buy things for the house, so she's also clearly working as a housemaid, until Thomas Cobb in December 1784 records, and I quote, "Mrs. Anne, wages discharged to the general joy of the family." Because this woman is obviously an absolute wagon, and they're glad to see the back of her, because a housekeeper can upset everything if she's not doing a good job, because it's just pervasive. It's the maids are unhappy, the male staff are unhappy, the linen isn't being managed, the china, everything, because the housekeepers are absolutely everywhere. Frances Power Cobb talks about having to take charge of the household due to neglect. And she also talks a lot about Martha Jones, who she fondly remembers in her autobiography as Joni. And she writes, and I quote, "The charge of my little person was committed to my mother's maid, the housekeeper Martha Jones. She came to my mother, a blooming girl of 18, and died of old age and sorrow when I left Newbridge. At my father's death half a century afterwards, she was a fine, fair, broad-shouldered woman with a certain refinement above her class." Of course she had to have refinement, because she worked at Newbridge, you know. "Her father had been an officer in the army, and she was educated, not very extensively, at some little school in Dublin, where her particular friend was Moore, the poet's sister. Joni," in quotes, "was indulgence itself, and under her mild sway, with my mother for instructress in my little lessons of spelling and geography, I was as happy a little animal as well might be." Of course, it couldn't be further from the truth, because the wage books tell a totally different story about Joni. She first appears in May 1810 in the account books as a young girl, possibly of 18. She's only paid £4 a quarter, which then rises to £4 5 shillings, so she's clearly given more responsibility. That rises to £4 16 shillings. So that's in track with what Frances Power Cobb is saying. You know, this girl is getting promoted through the ranks up to something like maybe personal maid. And then Mrs. Kiernan is hired at £5 5 shillings per quarter, which is in line with a housekeeper. So she's then demoted, because this more qualified housekeeper comes in and takes over the running of the house. And then in 1829, Charles Cobb pays to Martha Jones gratuity on her marriage at £10. She's given £10, she goes off and she gets married, and obviously lives a perfectly happy life and does not die of heartache when Frances Power Cobb leaves the house. So a very different story in reality. There's a gap in ladies' maids then in Newbridge. There isn't one until the sort of Edwardian period, when Mrs. Cobb is living in the house entirely on her own in the 1901 census and has 12 indoor staff, one of whom is a ladies' maid, Elizabeth Davis, who's the only member of staff from England. So quite the cat among the pigeons. And she goes on and is clearly in close proximity with Mrs. Cobb and travels her to the Channel Islands. But you could have gotten a much nicer job as lady's maid if you went to work for Lady Isabel Talbot de Malahide and Malahide Castle, because you would have been included on her travels to the south of France, Italy, Switzerland, Canada, America, Egypt, Sicily, Rome, Naples, Sri Lanka, Buenos Aires, San Francisco, Toronto, China, Japan, Honolulu, and Hong Kong. And Lady Isabel talks about when Miss Abbott, her lady's maid, gets appendicitis in Honolulu and the struggle of finding somebody to help her get dressed every morning. That's the Canadian nursemaid at Newbridge, Nurse Dwight, sitting on the front steps with the two boys. Housekeepers, ladies' maids, housekeepers, multidisciplinary at Newbridge. And in July 1791, to Madam Farmer, discharged with my curse. She was described as a thing calling herself a housekeeper. So there were clearly a lot of impersonation because you didn't know where these people were coming from. All you had to do was rely on their little references that they were handing in, which could easily be forged unless you knew people. There's also a lot of accounts of people going on holidays, staying in another Irish country house and stealing staff because that was really the only way of a good insurance policy that they were good staff having lived under them. Housekeeping ledgers, very, very interesting. They tell you how much money was being spent. The Cobbs in housekeeping could spend anything in 1 year from £162 to £718, and the housekeeper was responsible for all this. You know, I always say, go find me another job in the 19th century where there's a woman involved in looking after so much money. You're buying food from England, you're sending the coachman to elite grocers in Dublin, you're managing what's being slaughtered on the farm, you're keeping the stores for the cook, you're managing the linen closets, you're managing all the china, the glass, the delf, the ceramics, the plated ware. You know, the Newbridge inventories just go to show you how much there is under the housekeeper's control, because she has to audit it every year and make sure all the expensive china and glass is there. And as the 19th century gets longer and the material wealth of these families grows, there's more china, more glass, because they're trying to show off their wealth and their status. To the extent that when Mrs. McCormick, the housekeeper in Newbridge, leaves in 1854, it's planned absolutely to a T, because Mrs. Little, the next housekeeper, arrives on the exact same day, because you get in the accounts book, to Mrs. McCormick, gratuity £2 and 4 days' wages to the fourth. The very next line in the account book, to Mrs. Little, her expenses on the train, because you can't be without a housekeeper for more than 2 seconds. So one leaves, one comes in. So some very funny and important quotes about housekeepers. Now, their earnings varied hugely. Mrs. Hill at Newbridge was only earning £30 a year, whereas the Headford housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, was earning £50 a year. But then there's also differentiation between those provided with accommodation. If you had your own house, you were given less money because your rent was being accumulated, whereas if you were living in the house, you would be earning more money. So the housekeeping account books, there's an example from the Newbridge one, and you can see the fastidious every day, and then she had to, at the end of the week, bring it up to Charles Cobb, and he would sign off, and in his account book then you can see housekeeping, 1 week's wages paid, and the housekeeping expense paid. Now, cooks, very, very important. Isabella Beaton says the influence of the cook is immense upon the happiness of the whole household. So, you could have an under butler if you needed one, or a hall room boy, or a still room maid, but every house had to have a cook, and they vary hugely, and the content of the family is very much dependent on the wares being provided. Thomas Cobb never left his cook behind when he went to Bath. He always brought Mrs. Murphy with him, because he just couldn't bear to be without. There's a letter him writing to the servant, and he says, thank you for the butter. He's living in Bath, and he says, thank you so much for the butter. He's so glad to have the Irish butter with him. So there was this distinction between Irish and English food that came about from the ingredients that they were using. And Irish cooks, they really wanted this. Now, you could have a plain cook for only £20 or £40 a year, which was pretty good in comparison to the male chefs, or the French chefs. Like Lord Clonbrock hired a French chef called Remy for 25 guineas a year. But he was later discharged for being very irregular and negligent. So the French cooks weren't always what they were made to be. Then Thomas Cobb has heartache. Mrs. Murphy leaves, and he hires a new cook called Mrs. O'Byrne. In 1787, he exclaimed, "The cookmaid's wages and discharged her. Her name O'Byrne. May the devil burn her eternally." So she didn't make him very happy. And that goes to show you Mrs. Beaton was very true about the happiness of the whole household. While at Newbridge, the cook was always female and always Irish, and the name is certainly not English. It's obviously very local or from Dublin. The Santries at the Domvilles at Santry Court opted for male chef, James Dalton, the cook, was hired at 24 guineas and lasted only a year. And then they went for a much cheaper cook, Catherine Ford, at 13 guineas. So if a female cook was a lot cheaper, particularly a local one. So you could, 24 guineas versus 13 guineas is a huge saving to be made there. But that goes to show the importance of dining and banqueting and what they were serving up to their guests. And many mouths to feed for the poor cooks. It could be anywhere from 2 to 15 to 35 to 45 of a night. So you've got a huge ratio of staff upstairs and downstairs. 36 family being fed upstairs, 6 staff downstairs. Dinner parties at Headford went from 16 to 90 to 295 people. That's what they classified as a... And also, it's impossible, to quote Terry Dooley, it's impossible to gauge the influence over acquisitions of housekeepers, stewards and butlers. Astute retailers might well cultivate these lesser and shadowy figures on what is much too much marketing. The cook could be selling out waste products like tallow from old spent candles or lard or things like that to laundries, and she could be making her own money out the back door of the house, selling scrap food to other poor people. And Mrs. Beaton says, the cook, however, is at the head of the kitchen, and in proportion to her possession of the qualities of cleanliness, neatness, order, regularity, and celerity of action, her influence appear in the conduct of those who are as under her, as it is upon her that the whole responsibility of the business of the kitchen rests. So very, very important. And this is a little graph that goes to show you the comparison between the amount of ladies' maids, which is a very intimate job, so ladies' maids over here, and then you've got housekeepers on the other side, and then the high turnover of cooks in the middle. Just goes to show their absolute importance in hiring and firing the cooks. Okay, we have time to talk about gardeners. We very quickly romp out to the garden. At Prospect House, which was later Ardgillan in 1799, James Farrell was hired as the gardener, £20 a year, and his duties were listed as, and I quote, to have a general inspection and care of everything about Prospect. And when my family are not there, he and the maids are to use the produce of the garden. Because unlike your kitchen or your cellar, which closes when you leave, your garden has to continue. So if you go to England for the summer, the gardener is responsible for staying. There's an absolutely brilliant story from Knockdrin when Richard Leving is away in England, and Bishop Nulty calls up to the house to have a look around the house, and he finds the gardener out on the pond with his wife in a boat cruising around, and the gardener shouts all this awful insult at the bishop for intruding, because he's just clearly playing Lord of the Manor while the family are away, because you always left your gardener behind to look after it. There's also a lot of perks. So that same gardener at Ardgillan was given the use of the produce of the garden, cow's milk, but must rear calves for my use. They are likewise to have the use of the potatoes, reserving a sufficiency for my family. And at Clonbrock, the gardener was paid £65 a year, which is a huge sum, which is just under what the steward, who manages the entire estate, is getting at £68. And he even has an under-steward working under him, so they're very important. Whereas at the private secretary's lodge in the Phoenix Park, the gardener was only earning £20 a year. So there's clearly a huge differentiation in wages between decorative gardens, like at the private lodge, versus a productive kitchen garden, which has to feed the entire family and the estate. There's a great account at Newbridge, because we have the references of William Clark from when he arrives into the house in 1905. No, sorry, he leaves in 1905. He arrives in 1892, and he gets £55 a year, a cottage on the estate, and a cow and a calf and 4 ton of coal a month, which is a huge, big perk. And you can see all the different houses in the north of Ireland that he comes down to, eventually going to work in Holywood Rath in Dublin, where he's pinched to come and work at Newbridge. And then he leaves. He goes to work in Scotland because his wife is unwell, and she's obviously gone to get clean air, comes back to Newbridge for a long time, and he's very sorry. They write on his departure, "I'm very sorry you are leaving me, and hope that you will like your new place and Mrs. Clark will recover her health." He goes into Glasnevin and he sets up his own dairy company, which becomes Clark's, which people who grew up in Glasnevin in the 50s will remember Clark's, and their milk bottles and everything. So there's another big part of Fingal history here of the country house and the market gardening that grows out of the Irish country house, is that all these gardeners and people who work under the gardeners learnt their trade and their craft in these things that went into the market gardening. And there's a huge amount of history of all these people, even just from the Newbridge estate, who then went on and set up their own plant nurseries or productive market garden farms or brands like Clark's and Glasnevin. And it also goes to show that Mr. Clark was responsible for looking after the herd at Newbridge as well. So the idea of a gardener is a lot more multifaceted than we thought, and really the gardener looked after everything. And Milo Talbot, growing up at Malahide Castle, the seventh Baron's father, he has very fond memories of the gardener and also the gamekeeper Egan, who used to take them shooting rabbits. So there's a responsibility on the gardeners and the gamekeepers to teach the young sons of the houses sport and how to look after themselves. And that the very first member of staff Archbishop Cobb hires when he builds Newbridge is Dixon, the gamekeeper, and he gives him money to buy guns and to teach my sons shooting. So it's a very important kind of skill. And there's all these other brilliant records of country houses. Like we have this map of the servants' quarters at Newbridge that shows you the bedrooms that the staff were living in on the basement floor, which were complemented by 6 estate cottages. The estate cottages on Newbridge are with the best quality. The census ranked the quality of all housing, and the gate lodges at Newbridge were the best housing of all the gate lodges in Fingal, because they were high standard. Based on the materials that they were built from. And that's the history of the family retaining occupancy throughout, maintaining the estate, and that helps to explain why Newbridge was so, why the staff stayed at Newbridge for so long. You know, we had staff who stayed 50, 60 years. At Lannistown Castle at the front, there was a castle lodge there, and there was one family for 100 years, and 4 generations of the family lived in the one cottage, and they all worked on the estate, because it was a great place to work. It was like getting a job in the Guinnesses or, in the civil service. It really good employment because the family were there all year long and really high quality. That's Knockdrin, the Leving family house at Westmeath. There's Clonbrock. And in the backgrounds of all these photographs, you see little servants waiting at the door. That's one of the gate lodges at the front, at the Kilcray Gate at Newbridge, which you'll see. I always think it's so unfortunate that the house, the collection, the archives, everything survives at Newbridge, and the only thing we don't have are the gate lodges. And then there are other estates around Fingal. They have all the gate lodges, but they don't have the house. So you kind of have to. But there's a whole history there of people who live in the gate lodges. They appear in the photographs. So while this might be an interesting photograph of Mrs. Corbally and her sister sitting in the carriage at the Pony and Trap at Newbridge, and the dash end it's also a photograph of Donovan, the groom, looking after the horse, and it goes to show you the relationship they had. And across Fingal, our architecture is very telling of the country house estate and the people that found employment on them. This is the only record we have of Joseph Hill, who was the longest-serving steward at Newbridge. In 270 years at Newbridge, there was only ever 3 stewards, because they all stayed for 50, 60, 70 years. And Mr. Hill had grown up in Meath as a farmer's son. He went to Clonbrock and served as a under clerk to the steward, came to Newbridge as steward in 1856, and he retired in 1913. So again, you have this history of, I wasn't like that in your grandfather's day, because all these staff had stayed there very long. And he lived in the biggest house in Donabate, across from the Protestant church, bigger than the rectory. The Carolyn's house, exactly. But it goes to show you how important the steward was in looking at like a 10,000 acre estate all under his care. You'd want to befriend this man, because he'd get your son that job, or your daughter the job up in the big house. So these people were very important, and it's reflected in the time of accommodation. And Mr. Hill was living here. He had 4 daughters, and one son who unfortunately died very young. And he was married to the housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, who was Swiss. They met when he was serving an apprenticeship in Rathmines. He was living next door, renting a room, and she was the lady's maid next door to a judge. And they obviously got married there, went to Clonbrock, had 5, their first child, came to Newbridge, had 5 children, all recorded in the parish registry. They're buried in the local graveyard. His wife, his mother, his son is remembered there. And then he married again, his second wife, the second Mrs. Hill, he was 74 and she was 36. And she became the housekeeper again. So you had 2 Mrs. Hills, and they were totally different women, but they both served as housekeeper of Newbridge. And they all lived in this house in the village, so I'm absolutely desperate to track down their descendants. And then you got the Steward's house in Malahide. This is where the O'Neill family lived, and it's now the home of the Malahide Historical Society. This is the gravestone of the Hill family in Donabate. And then, this is a fantastic photograph from Larry Smith of Donabate, of his father, who was a chauffeur. And his father, Con Smith, was the groom. And that's very interesting because it's a transition from horses to cars. So, and this man taught all the present inhabitants of Newbridge how to drive, and used to look after their cars. And they grew up in the courtyard. His children grew up in the courtyard in Newbridge. And Newbridge didn't have electric light until 1964. And his children went to the local school in Donabate, and everybody used to slag them for growing up in the sticks in Newbridge because it was all growing up by oil lamp, whereas everyone in Donabate had electric light. So it wasn't all glamour growing up in the Irish country house. Thank you very much.